Last time here, I took a look at the PlayStation portable accessory camera, the PSP 300, better known as the Go! Cam. It was an interesting bit of gaming history, but as a camera, well, interesting is not the first among the adjectives I would use to describe it. But it seems Sony saw enough value in portable game consoles with cameras that they included two of them in the PlayStation Vita, which is what we're recording on right now. Or at least they didn't want to feel spec sheet shame compared to Nintendo, who already had two generations of handheld consoles with built-in cameras with the DSi and 3DS already on shelves. Hello again, I am Blunty, and while the PlayStation Vita hosted several acclaimed titles and built a small fan base, the system is regarded as a commercial failure. And a notable lack of support from Sony and major third-party developers, along with competition from the significantly more successful Nintendo 3DS, kind of... Those are not my words, by the way, except that those are from Wikipedia. So even if people who care enough about the Vita to carefully document it on a Wikipedia page think it was a miserable failure and an embarrassment to Sony, then who am I to argue? Now, with the traditional Sony fan drone baiting done with, let's talk Vita cameras. There were two independent cameras on the Vita, one on the front, one on the back. Both were very meager 0.3 megapixel sensors capable only of 640 by 480 resolution at best. This was in fact the same max resolution as the much more successful 3DS, but of course it had three cameras, so it could take 3D images, so still a win for Nintendo? Sony's cameras, though, did have better specs. With a more powerful system driving them, they could run at 60 frames per second in max res, or, if dumped to a quarter resolution, 320 by 240, they could run at 120 frames per second. Not all that useful for basic camera work or photography or video recording or anything like that, but when used in games, those kinds of frame rates gave a much improved capability for a cleaner, more accurate and smoother head and face detection and augmented reality and object tracking and all that kind of stuff, which is of course why Sony likely prioritized that frame rate performance stuff over a sensor with a resolution more suited for actual, normal, useful camera photography use. Functionality as a camera using the built-in app was relatively simplistic. Very simplistic. But it had a clean and functional interface, which was fine, easy to understand, easy to use. One little gotcha though is the ability to shoot in 4:3 mode, default for most still photography, or a widescreen 16:9 mode. But should you choose the 16:9 mode, you're actually not making the image any wider. All Sony do in that mode is crop off the top and bottom of the 640 by 480 image, so in widescreen mode, you're getting significantly lower resolution. Better to stay in 4:3, and then later, if you want a widescreen view, crop it yourself. Then you can choose with more finesse where the top and bottom of the frame should be. A little more creative freedom in the editing. Same thing is true of the square aspect ratio option, of course. It just crops the sides. It doesn't actually use more of the sensor or anything like that. Oddly, when the Vita first launched, it was incapable of recording video at all. And it wasn't until firmware version 1.60, released nearly 3 months after the Japanese launch, that video recording was finally unlocked. If memory serves, that feature was active by the time it was launched in the rest of the world in late February 2012, so not something most of the user base had to deal with, I don't think. Correct me if I'm wrong, I should have researched this. All I remember was I imported a Japanese model at launch and it didn't do video, and I was very perplexed by that. Anyway, it was not something most of the user base had to deal with, at least not for long, and it was more of an indication that the Japanese launch was a bit premature, happening before even basic features were finished and baked into the firmware. Classic Sony, I guess. PlayStation 5 is only just now getting 1440p. Sony. Now, unlike the PSP camera and its spectacularly mind-shatteringly terrible editing app, with the Vita, Sony offered no such editing functionality. At all. The only thing the system was capable of doing while taking or after taking a photo was cropping the image. That's it. No filters, no stickers, no text, no adjustments, no frames, no diptychs, no collages, nothing at all except crop. And even that could only crop to the standard aspect ratio of the Vita's native screen, so even that was of extraordinarily limited usefulness. You couldn't just crop square, for example. So, Sony and the continually unfathomable choices went from one of the world's worst photo editing apps on the PSP to zero editing functionality on the Vita. Nice choice of path, Sony. Nailed it. If you can't do something at least half-assed, don't do it at all, I suppose. And beyond that, though, while shooting even, you have a much more crippled experience than even the PSP camera had. At least there, on the PSP, you could adjust a couple of useful things like exposure compensation and even manually set white balance, two things that are pretty essential for taking photos. But nope, not here on Sony's half-assed Vita, it just automatic everything. It's full auto, 100% of the time, nothing you can do about it. If the camera misbehaves, well, your shot's just ruined. It's just... And worse still, its automatic adjustments are extremely poorly configured and extremely poorly calibrated. In absolutely zero lighting conditions, indoors, outdoors, full sun, shade, whatever it is, you can expect the white balance to be anywhere close to accurate? No, you can't. No, you can't. Exposure seems to be whole scene, not center weighted or anything useful like that, so for dynamic range, it will look washed out, muddy, it will have blown highlights and grey shadows most of the time. There's a ton of chromatic aberration in the high contrast transition areas, and the colours are not what I would call true to life colours. Compared to the PSP camera though, it does at least have noticeably better sharpness and a lot less pixel noise. Does have a lot worse lens flaring though, like tremendously worse, like super duper worse. There's a little plastic plate over the lens on the Vita, which just it does that rainbow, oil slick on water kind of, it's the most hideous lens flare ever. The PSP camera is actually better than the Vita camera. Now, considering the original models of the Vita had an unusually good OLED screen, a highly praised OLED screen, it was amazing. No one else is doing that, which even by today's standards, a decade later, still looks pretty damn good, by the way. You'd have thought they'd try a little harder to make the images the camera can generate worthy to display on such a good screen, especially considering how good camera phones were getting in 2011, which was the era of the iPhone 4S. And its own Sony-made Exmor-R 8-megapixel rear camera sensor, by the way, which was the first phone camera that I started putting to work on a regular way on my own video production uses. Impressive enough, was it? In fact, I once put it up against Nikon's own absolute top-of-the-line DSLR for a side-by-side shootout. It was like, the iPhone 4S and the Nikon camera, which was, I think, $6,000 or $8,000 worth of camera and lens, and it bloody well held its own. More or less. Most of the time. With some cavats. But once more, as I've said in both my Game Boy camera and PSP camera videos recently now, these weren't intended to have a life as a photographer's tool. They were toys. And more specifically in the Vita's case, they were a gameplay gimmick, primarily intended to offer game developers new and interesting ways to play and interact with their games, with things like player head and face tracking or object tracking and augmented reality and that kind of gimmickry. And for that purpose, the cameras worked as intended. They worked pretty well, actually. Their high frame rate sensor readout teamed up with the processing power of the Vita. It made them a lot more practical for that stuff than the vastly more successful 3DS was capable of doing. Sadly for Sony, the technologically inferior 3DS still kicked their ass all the way up and down the street for the entirety of its shelf life. So badly beaten was Sony, they've never bothered even trying to make another portable since then. And I doubt they'll ever try again, like ever. Even with the example of the Nintendo Switch out there just kicking ass all over the shop, whose own form factor is a reflection of the one Sony chose for both their handhelds, which I bet is just really annoying at least a few old-timer Sony executives out there. Nintendo's stomping along, snidely growling up their side of the mouth. Yeah, see, that's this is how it's done right. You were close, but this is how it should have been done. No camera at all on the Switch, though. Not even a camera accessory for the Switch. Hadn't really thought about that. Mildly surprised someone hasn't tried to make one by now. Anyway, all in all, I enjoy shooting on the PSP camera a lot more than I do the Vita camera. The Vita has a much better screen, which is better for shooting outdoors, because you can actually see what you're doing. The PSP screen is miserable to use in sunlight. I was shooting like this. I was sheltering the screen, having it right up in face and sheltering the sun. No. It was a miserable experience to try and shoot with it, but the results that were coming out of it, especially when you use that macro mode, you get nice and close up, relatively good detail, a bit of blur in the background and stuff like that. There's a lot more creative flexibility with the PSP camera than there is with the Vita camera. And, quality-wise, the Vita is better, but it's not so much better to make it worth using over the more creative flexibility you get with the PSP camera. So, I don't know. If I ever go out shooting with either of these two cameras again, I will take the PSP camera not the Vita one, I think, because it's just a little bit more fun. The Vita is it's not fun. There's no charm to it. There's no character to it. It's just a kind of crappy camera that was, you know, so common in you know, third-rate Android phones of the day. You know, it's the exact same camera, lens, and sensor that they were using in those, obviously. So no surprise there. But yeah, the Game Boy camera and the PSP camera are certainly more fun, more flexible, more creatively inspiring than the Vita camera is, despite its technological, well, I was about to say improvements, but it's lower resolution than the PSP camera was as well. So there is that. And yeah, poor old Vita. We had such high hopes for it, didn't we? Seemed like such a good idea. Then Sony just loaded up their gun full of good old-fashioned Sony-branded foot bullets and unloaded the entire magazine right into the left and right foot. Thanks for watching. Thanks as always to the patrons scrolling up above there. I'm sorry if you're a big Vita fan. Look, you know, I tried to be a Vita fan. I got two of them. I got the original Japanese one and I bought the local one. It's not much you can do when they, so, you know, the first party and third party support just isn't there to make it worth using the damn thing for more than like 3 or 4 games. Even then, I'd rather emulate them so I can use a comfortable controller.